Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, I mean, it's great that they were having you on because, you know, you specialize in dissent in China. And the big news is these riots going on in Guangzhou over the COVID lockdowns after they said they were going to ease COVID restrictions, I believe.
I don't know if they really said they were going to ease that kind of COVID restriction.
No, what did they say? They're going to optimize.
Yeah. But so the Guangzhou COVID lockdowns, is that pretty representative of the kind of protests that are going on in China?
Yeah. So we've recorded, let me put this in a sort of the backdrop of our findings so far, because I think it'll help explain how typical or not those particular protests were. So we did a quarterly report collecting information about dissent in China from June to September. So it's actually a quarter plus one. And we found around 668 events of dissent. And most of these, the far majority of them were protests, or sort of offline protests and demonstrations.
What kind of size?
The size of those on average, so the most frequent one that we coded was 10 to 99. So sort of moderate size. That's the most frequently seen. But there were a lot that we would consider large scale, over 100 people or in the hundreds, but less than 1,000. But going back to the frequency of different types of protests, up to now, so that data was collected, 668 was collected up to the end of September. Now, you know, it's been a couple months since we've done that, or almost a couple months, and we're up to nearly 800 events. So, you know, the frequency of protests and these are geographically pretty well distributed around most of central China. So not including some of the western regions. So the frequency of dissent of this sort of protest is quite high. Among those that we found so far, there's about 50 to 60. I don't have the precise number in front of me right now, but 50 to 60 that have something to do with COVID policies or COVID restrictions. So they're people that are usually again offline with some online cases, people that are protesting or refusing to cooperate with COVID restrictions. So you know, it's not rare. In just a matter of a few months, we have dozens of COVID-related protests and refusal to cooperate, and these are often in groups, not just individuals. So from that perspective, it's not rare what happened in Guangzhou. What I think is maybe less frequently seen is sort of the intensity of that event. So people overturning cars, sort of wrecking barriers. This does happen. There are other cases that we've reported these past few months where this has happened, but it's not the sort of typical mode of protest that we see.
Well, so what is the more typical mode of protest?
I mean, it's still people gathering in groups. It's still collective action, but I think rarely do you see people, you know, I mean, again, overturning a car is not something that you see in an average protest in China. There are cases. There's more than a few cases where people were sort of like trying to take down barriers. I think that often the sort of the object of grievance or the object of discontent are these barriers, right? Because that's what the COVID restrictions are all about, is limiting people's movement. Often it's preventing people from working. This is one of the major underlying grievances, is that it sort of just stops everybody's life for weeks or months at a time, and can really lead to some livelihood issues. So a lot of times sort of barriers that are preventing people from moving across the city or between areas are sort of the object of protest symbolically. But I think the level of intensity, I have the sense from seeing the videos and some of the footage from the protests in Guangzhou that it's just a little bit higher than sort of the average intensity you see for a lot of the cases that we documented.
Yeah, I did remember seeing a video of them basically attacking a COVID testing station. And that struck me as more unusual than what you were saying before about the barriers.
Right. I mean, so COVID testing stations, that's another interesting, sort of symbolically, it's another interesting subject. There are other protests like we call them sign protests, or well, we categorize them as sign protests, but they can include graffiti. So it's not necessarily just signs that people are hanging up. And there are cases, I think it was in Beijing at several, or Shanghai, I can't remember right now, it was several testing stations. People were basically putting graffiti on the sides of these testing stations, decrying the restrictions and demanding freedom. And sometimes it was very explicit, the language that was used.
Well, I guess I'm also thinking about the other, big protest that's been happening is people refusing to pay mortgages. The whole, kind of Evergrande, the larger real estate crisis. People.
Yeah, that's a pretty different situation, though, right?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Like, is like these other types of dissent that are happening, because it is not all tearing down COVID barriers.
Right. I mean, that's an apt question, because it's the most frequent type of dissent that we've recorded. Something between 40 and 50% of these cases that we've recorded to date have something to do with housing. So the actual issue can differ a little bit. So it can be issues of delayed handover, or what in Chinese is called lanwei. It's basically like stalled housing project, which is one of the most frequent. But there's also cases where it's building quality issues. So people feel like there was false advertising, or another frequent issue that drives these sorts of protests are accusations of fraud. So the model for funding a lot of these housing projects over decades has been one that allows, because of regulations in China, it allows developers to take money from a new project that they're advertising and then use it towards the construction of a previous project. So they're not, the money that you're investing in your house or your new home as a home buyer doesn't necessarily get put into the home that you're expecting. It could be put into a different project altogether. And so it's sort of a liquidity issue. And because of economic slowdown or accumulated debt, these companies are no longer able to make up that gap. It leads to stalled housing. So a lot of that issue that a lot of protesters in China call misappropriation of funds, they consider it a type of fraud, that the real estate developers are telling them one thing, that this money is being used towards your project, and it's really not. So fraud is another common driver of this, at least from the way that we interpret these protests. But yeah, it's something like 40 to 50% of the protests that in our database that we've been tracking have something to do with this large category of issues. So it really is a major driver of discontent and collective action right now. So
in terms of that, the people would be protesting the real estate companies?
So we also code for target of the protests. I should maybe explain that, lay that out really quickly. So we're going through a bunch of different sources, whether it's social media or news reports or civil society organizations, NGOs that are doing reports about different types of dissent in China. And we take these cases and we code them through a methodology that we develop across a number of variables. So there's obvious ones like date and location, but we're also interpreting the data that we have, the evidence that we have about each, to look at the size, the scale, the issue, the target, the demands, whether there was any evidence of repression, and whether there was any evidence of concessions. So was there some positive result from this activism? So on the question of target, the target for housing related protests can vary. So definitely the real estate developer is probably the most common, but actually the local government gets pulled into these a lot of times. And the reason for that is because when, the home buyers, the protesters are, this is a major livelihood issue. They put a lot of money into these, into their future homes. And it has a huge impact on their economic well-being. So if this has been stalled for months or even years at a time, they're really digging into the details behind their cases, and they understand that the government, in a lot of these cases, in most cases, are tasked with supervising these deals. So there's a body in most local governments have a body that's supposed to supervise basically the escrow account where they're putting these funds. After a certain amount of time, a lot of the protesters start to ask, what is the government doing about this? Why aren't they? Why isn't there sufficient oversight of the way that these funds are being used or misused in the eyes of protesters? So they often will direct their discontent at local regulators, also banks, where the escrow account itself is, where this account lies. This is one of the things that has led to this more recent evolution in recent months of the mortgage boycott that you had mentioned. So this is just, even though housing protest has been going on for a long time, this more organized action of directing the dissent at banks and trying to put pressure on banks is a little bit more recent. And that's an effort to try to find a different pressure point to get concessions when these housing projects have been stalling for so long.